Without doubt, one of the main subjects in the Book of Proverbs is the relationship between a man and a woman, and by extension, between a husband and wife, and parents and children. The lengthy prologue, which you'll remember is the first 9 chapters of the book, it's significantly shaped by this issue. And what we want to do in this study then is to highlight the main strands of Proverbs teaching in what is a continuously relevant area of human activity. And as in previous studies, just to forewarn you, I'll be throwing out multiple references which you may wish to jot down and return to in your own time for further reflection. So here's how I will approach this. The first thing I want to address is the perspective of the Book of Proverbs and how that shapes what it has to say. Secondly, and this is where we're obviously going to spend the greater part of our time, we want to hear the fundamental directions that Proverbs gives for male-female relationships. Thirdly and finally, we'll note how Proverbs addresses the issue of raising children, and sons in particular. So let's start then by saying something about the perspective of Proverbs. And I wonder, did you notice this in your reading of the book? Proverbs consistently evaluates a woman through a man's eyes and never a man through a woman's eyes. The father addresses his son, never his daughter. He warns him against an unfaithful wife, but never warns his daughter against an unfaithful husband. Lady Wisdom addresses the men in the gate, not the woman in the bazaar. Lady Folly and her co-conspirators that we meet in the book, they seduce the gullible male, but no equivalent male seduces the gullible girl. Solomon, in his large swathes of the book, never mentions a good or bad husband, only a good or bad wife. And it's the same in the 30 sayings of the wise, the sayings of Agur, and the sayings of King Lemuel that he received from his mother. They all address the son, but not the daughter. And the book, of course, closes with a portrait of an ideal wife, without once mentioning an ideal husband for a woman. Now, just to qualify that immediately, it should be noted that several references to mother demonstrate that the woman is very much involved in her son's education and instruction in the home. Chapter 1, verse 8, chapter 6, verse 20, and chapter 10, verse 1 all refer to the mother at key points. And in order for women in general, and indeed the ideal woman of chapter 31 in particular, in order for them to be able to instruct their household, she herself must be instructed in Israel's wisdom. Chapter 31, verse 26 says, when describing this portrait of the ideal wife, she speaks with wisdom, and faithful instruction is on her tongue. What we need to note is that whilst Proverbs is written to impart its wisdom to all, it uses the literary device of a father instructing his son. The immediate reader of the book's instruction is a young man about to strike out into adulthood. And Proverbs is written with the emphasis that the Bible generally carries, where it is the male offspring who is expected to assume leadership in defining the family's identity and values. In other words, Proverbs takes the role of headship very seriously. Anyone reading the book outside of a young man about to move out into independent adulthood has some work to do by way of application, whether they be male or female. And it's not really that difficult. For example, if the young man is told to be wary of a certain type of lady, then, ladies, don't be that type of lady. Proverbs is no less relevant if you are female than the passages in the Bible are to a man, which describe our covenant relationship with God in terms of a marriage. Jehovah is Israel's husband. Christ is our bridegroom. It just requires some application in our reading. And maybe some of you are thinking, what was all that about? But I'm trying to do justice to how the book is written, and therefore what is required from us for us to read it for all that it is worth. So let's come then to some recurring themes in Proverbs teaching on male-female relationships. And I'll mention 4 areas, 4 strands. Number 1, avoid the immoral woman. It isn't overstatement to say that the father bombards his son with repeated warnings about 2 types of women: the prostitute, and more commonly again, the promiscuous wife, sometimes referred to as the strange or the foreign wife. 65 verses are devoted to these femme fatales, and I use the term literally, as we shall see. Remarkably, these dangerous women feature even more in the prologue than Lady Wisdom does. The adulteress first appears in chapter 2, verse 16 to 22, but the whole of chapter 5, chapter 6, verse 20 to 35, and all of chapter 7 deals exclusively with these deviant and deadly females. And these are very powerful passages of Scripture which vividly describe the threat of seduction, the tactics that will be employed, and the stakes involved in matters of sexual purity. Essential reading, I would suggest. Given the amount of material then in the prologue devoted to this issue, it's perhaps surprising then that it features only sparingly in the rest of the book and its many wisdom sayings from chapter 10 onwards. But perhaps Proverbs 23, verses 26 to 28, summarizes much of the warning given to the young man. It says this: "My son, give me your heart and let your eyes keep to my ways. For a prostitute is a deep pit, and a wayward wife is a narrow well. Like a bandit she lies in wait and multiplies the unfaithful among men." What is noteworthy is the emphasis which Proverbs places upon the principal means of the young man's seduction. Certainly how the woman is dressed plays into it. Chapter 7, verse 10. Then came out a woman to meet him, dressed like a prostitute and with crafty intent. How she looks at her victim is another powerful tactic. Chapter 6, verse 25 tells us she captivates with her eyes. But it is how the woman talks to the man which is her principal weapon. Her speech is seductive. She utters seductive words. 2:16, 7:5. Chapter 5, verse 3 says, "For the lips of an adulteress drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil. She has a smooth tongue," 6:24. "With persuasive words she led him astray. She seduced him with her smooth talk," 7:21. And I would say to you, take time to read the verses before 7:21, which describe very vividly the simple young man's seduction. And when you read how it plays out, I guarantee you will be left thinking this: there's nothing new under the sun. I say again, it would be difficult to overstate the importance that Proverbs places upon this danger to the young man who would desire to live life wisely. Avoid the immoral woman. Secondly, and much more positive, invest in a strong relationship with your wife. And it isn't correct to say what sometimes we trot out at weddings or whatever. It isn't correct to say that Proverbs teaches that the young man must only have one woman that he gives his affection to. Proverbs says he must have two women in his life. Several times in the prologue, Lady Wisdom invites the young man into a lifelong, intimate relationship with herself. Chapter 8, verse 32 to 35. "Now then, my sons, listen to me. Blessed are those who keep my ways. Listen to my instruction and be wise. Do not ignore it. Blessed is the man who listens to me, watching daily at my doors, waiting at my doorway. For whoever finds me finds life and receives favor from the Lord." Read again the early verses of chapter 9 as Lady Wisdom invites the young man into a deep and meaningful relationship with metaphorical Lady Wisdom. But it also, this is key, it also directs him into an intimate, faithful, committed relationship with his wife. The greatest defense against the strange woman is a full, strong, healthy relationship with his wife, who he has entered into covenant with before God. And Proverbs specifically, and the Bible generally, let it be said, celebrates the joys of intimacy in marriage and upholds it as the only legitimate context for sexual expression. We get all embarrassed in a way that the writer of Proverbs does not, as he gives advice to the young man. Listen to this from chapter 5, verse 15 to 20. Drink water from your own cistern, running water from your own well. Should your springs overflow in the street, your streams of water in the public squares? Let them be yours alone, never to be shared with strangers. May your fountain be blessed, and may you rejoice in the wife of your youth, a loving doe, a graceful deer. May her breasts satisfy you always. May you ever be captivated by her love. Why be captivated, my son, by an adulteress? Why embrace the bosom of another man's wife? Continual commitment to an investment in a lifelong, loving relationship of marriage is the best defense against the spiritual disaster that accompanies sexual unfaithfulness. I think we need to recognize once again the perspective of the book of Proverbs. The expectation is that a young man entering adulthood will marry. That was the norm in Israel's society. Under the Old Covenant, God's blessing was very much associated with fields, flocks, and family. Not so under the New Covenant. Singleness is upheld as both a divine calling and a valid choice. Indeed, were Paul given his preference, there would be many more single believers because of the advantages that affords in the work of God. It's just being true to the testimony of Scripture. Avoid the immoral woman. Invest in a strong relationship with your wife. A third strand in the book of Proverbs teaching on male-female relationships is just its acknowledgement and celebration of the joys of a good wife. Proverbs is in no doubt that a wife is a good gift from God, and a good wife is a gift from God. Chapter 18, verse 22. He who finds a wife finds what is good and receives favor from the Lord. Chapter 19, verse 22. Houses and wealth are inherited from parents, but a prudent wife is from the Lord. Marriage is no light matter, and a wife either makes or breaks a man in his home and in the community. This is what Proverbs 12, verse 4 is saying. A wife of noble character is her husband's crown, but a disgraceful wife is like decay in his bones. We sort of hear something of the behind every good man is a good woman. The husband, saying that the husband gains respect and is held in honor on the basis of his wife's reputation as well as his own. And the opposite is true in the case of a disgraceful wife. An ignoble wife saps her husband's strength and vitality from within, like a spiritual form of bone cancer, decaying in his bones. He crumbles from within. And this point would not be complete without mentioning the lengthy description of the noble wife which concludes the book of Proverbs in chapter 31, verse 10 to 31. Now, as a self-esteem exercise, I would like all our ladies to read that section just before you turn into bed tonight and turn the light off for a good night's sleep. I mean, What have you all been playing at? This lady runs her own business, feeds the family with foreign delicacies, starts early and finishes late, has a property portfolio, is in good physical shape, makes her own clothes, ministers to the poor, is an expert in interior design, manages her household, and is respected by all for her wisdom born of her fear of the Lord. Now, before all the husbands text their wives and tell them to get their finger out, please just note that this is something of a composite picture. Listen, if she gets up while it is still dark, verse 15, and her lamp does not go out at night, verse 18, I would like her tested for drugs. The picture of the noble wife at the conclusion of the book balances the picture of Lady Wisdom at the start of the book. These are the type of qualities that will characterize a woman of substance, an ideal wife, a flesh and blood representative, the incarnation of wisdom. And the only thing that remains to be said on this is, Michelle, what's for supper? So, avoid the immoral woman. Invest in a strong relationship with your wife. See the joys of a good wife. Fourthly, understand the agony of a bad choice. Proverbs stresses two fundamental errors that the young man can make in life in this area of male-female relationship. First, he can end up with a wife who will be the undoing of him. 14 verse 1, the wise woman builds her house, but with her own hands the foolish one tears it down. And don't be blinded by good looks. Chapter 11 verse 22, like a gold ring in a pig's snout is a beautiful woman who shows no discretion. Be warned if you see a contentious character in your potential life partner. 27 verse 15 and 16. A quarrelsome wife is like a constant dripping on a rainy day. Restraining her is like restraining the wind or grasping oil with the hand. And undoubtedly, Proverbs makes its most witty observations in regard to a wife who is a hindrance rather than a help to her husband. There are several better than Proverbs throughout the book. Better to live on a corner of the roof than share a house with a quarrelsome wife. And that's actually one of the few Proverbs in the book which is repeated verbatim, 21:9 and 25:24. Better to live in a desert than with a quarrelsome and ill-tempered wife, 21:19. See, Proverbs pays great respect to the impact and influence a wife can have on her husband, for good or ill. But the second thing that Proverbs really stresses in this agony of a bad choice is the young man can betray his wife, or an older man can betray his wife and bring spiritual disaster upon himself. Now let me say immediately, remember the perspective of the book. It is written for the young man and his progression in life. Just because the damage inflicted upon the wife, and even the children, is not mentioned, does not mean it's unimportant. It is just not the focus of the instruction. And by the way, Proverbs stands out in the ancient world in its assessment of the relationship between a man and a woman in marriage. The wife is not viewed as mere chattel or simply a childbearer. She is upheld as a companion. And it is against such a high view of marriage that sexual sin is presented in the darkest of colours. The young man must not be so naive as to think he can be unfaithful and emerge unscathed. Can a man scoop fire into his lap without his clothes being burned? Can a man walk on hot coals without his feet being scorched? So is he who sleeps with another man's wife. No one who touches her will go unpunished. Blows and disgrace are his lot, and his shame will never be wiped away. Proverbs 6:27 through 33. Proverbs teaches that adultery is literally a dead end. It is said of the adulteress in chapter 2, verse 18 and 19, "For her house leads down to death, and her paths to the spirits of the dead. None who go to her return or attain the paths of life." Chapter 5:5, "Her feet go down to death. Her steps lead straight to the grave." Chapter 7:27, "Her house is a highway to the grave." A man's relationship to his wife is a matter of ultimate importance because of the stakes involved. Proverbs upholds the general teaching of the Bible that marriage is sacred ground. Let me just take a moment or two to say something briefly about the raising of children, and in particular sons, because of the perspective of the book. Proverbs is famous for its praise of the rod. He who spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is careful to discipline him. Chapter 13, verse 24. Please note that spare the rod, spoil the child is not in the Bible. This use of correction comes out of Proverbs' serious doctrine of wisdom. A hard way to wisdom is better than a soft way to death. 19 verse 18. "Discipline your son, for in that there is hope. Do not be a willing party to his death." Chapter 23, verse 13 and 14. "Do not withhold discipline from a child. If you punish him with the rod, he will not die. Punish him with the rod and save his soul from death." The truth is that sometimes words are not enough. 22:15. "Folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline will drive it far from him." And the only predictable outcome of a child left to himself without discipline is shame. 29:15. "The rod of correction imparts wisdom, but a child left to himself disgraces his mother." Now, a couple of things need to be said. Of course, the book of Proverbs is not legitimizing brutality. If discipline is born of love, and that is what Proverbs teaches, then it is by definition loving discipline. And loving discipline is never administered in a cruel and unrestrained way. That is a dreadful distortion of what the book of Proverbs calls for. And brutality should always be condemned for what it is. Secondly, and this is sometimes not understood, the use of the rod is not the only or even the major means of discipline and instruction that Proverbs commends. The rod is no panacea. The very existence of the book of Proverbs bears witness to that. The chief resource of parents is their instruction of the child. And we see this in the way that the father continually appeals to his son. In actual fact, the parents are to put forward their law, and the word is Torah. They're to put forward their Torah before the child as his guide in life. And Proverbs holds out the famous encouragement to parents. 22 verse 6. Train a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not turn from it. But it also insists, let's not absolutize one proverb to the expense of all the others. It also insists that the child must decide to receive instruction to profit from it. 13 verse 1. A wise son heeds his father's instruction, but a mocker does not listen to rebuke. And the father's appeal at the beginning of chapter 2 is this: my son, if you accept my words and store up my commands, if you call out for insight and cry aloud for understanding, and if you look for it. And the book of Proverbs recognizes the ugly reality that even from good and godly homes can arise those who despise 15 verse 20, mock 30 verse 17, and even curse 30 verse 11 their good and godly parents. Proverbs acknowledges that that happens. Those are some of the aspects of what we would call home life covered in the book of Proverbs. Perhaps as society degenerates further into moral chaos, and as many in the church drift further from our biblical moorings, perhaps a fresh reading of the book of Proverbs will renew our determination to walk in the fear of the Lord, which is the way of wisdom. That would certainly be my prayer as we work through these studies in the book of Proverbs.